in the next hour and a bit, the point is to discuss about SDGs and the pandemic, and to basically reflect together on what is the pandemic changing with regard to both the SDGs and the realities that we are facing. We will focus on 4 specific SDGs, and then also discuss more generally the 4 SDGs that we will be focusing on are SDG 3, focusing on health, 4, focusing on education, 8, focusing on work, and 10, focusing on inequalities. We will go more in details in a little bit. Basically, this is meant to be a workshop, so we will be asking a lot of input from you as well. So please be prepared to contribute and to take part in the discussion. I am hoping that together we can build a more, let's say, a robust understanding of what to expect of the SDGs in the coming period, and how basically the pandemic is affecting what we can do, and also how the pandemic is obviously affecting our ability to reach the goals that were set for 2030. Basically, what we will be doing, we'll have a short introductory part to get to know each other better, and to also provide a little bit of space for each of us to share how we're doing in this period. And then we will go a little bit through where the SDGs are coming from, and focusing then on the 4 SDGs I mentioned. And finally, we will conclude with a more general discussion on where the SDG agenda is going in the post-COVID-19 period. So let's start with the Mentimeter. Basically, thank you for your answers. I will go a little, because it's a little bit challenging to share the screen as from what I see. I see that basically it's a period that several of us when several of us are feeling tired, are feeling thankful, are uncertain about the future. There is frustration. Some are ready to act. Some are busy. Privileged, scared, grateful. There is a lot of work. We feel overwhelmed, bored of being at home, also optimistic. Some are focusing on self-development. Some are worried, a lot of work again, and caged, anxious. So I think we see we are all experiencing similar. We all are aware that this is a difficult period. We wanted to start the discussion from here, and from providing a space for all of us to reflect on how we feel. At the same time, I think it is important to acknowledge that and to think about the impact that this period has on our organizations. And the fact that this impact will be one that is going to be with us for a while. Having this in mind, the SDGs as an agenda, as a global agenda, has been and is affected by this pandemic as well. So the purpose of this workshop is to engage in a discussion on how exactly this is happening, and especially to focus on the 4 SDGs that I mentioned earlier. I would like to start with a few reflections on where the SDGs are coming from, maybe in more general terms to frame our discussion. And then we will go in, as I mentioned, on this, more specifically discussing the four SDGs. Basically, we are having the SDGs for a couple of years now. It's 5 years. The SDGs were adopted in 2015 by the UN. What I think is important is to see the SDGs not as an agenda that came up in 2015 alone. It is basically a process that has led to the development of these goals as we see them today. So that is what I would like to emphasize, that we have an international community that has been working on development challenges for since we have moved past the Second World War. There are several aspects that are relevant with regard to the Second World War that have generated basically the international development system that we have today. We had the Marshall Plan in Europe, we have the US engaging in this, and President Truman's 4 points referring to how support should be offered in those times. We have the moment when the Bretton Woods institutions came up, the World Bank, IMF, so the World Bank Group, and we basically have in many ways a rupture from the previous practices of the international system. So it is, from an international relations perspective, it is actually quite curious that states started to help each other in that way. Previously, there has been much more competition in the international system, and we had states that were perceiving each other much more as competitors. So after the Second World War, we see this huge shift towards states starting to support each other, which is a novelty and something that puzzles actually even to today the international relations scholars. So basically, we have the SDGs today because we have in the background the process of more than 70 years that made this possible. We have the UN being set up in the aftermath of the Second World War, the organization that has basically generated the SDGs. Now, some more specific things. So as an agenda, the SDG agenda is obviously following the Millennium Development Goals, which were in force until 2015, and it's actually developing that agenda. The MDGs have not received the same level of attention as the SDGs, basically. It is very likely that a part of the success of the SDGs relates to the fact that quite some efforts were done also to promote and to achieve the MDGs previously. But definitely the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals as an agenda is much broader than what we've ever seen in the past. So I think one important aspect to emphasize with the SDGs is the breadth of the agenda. And I think this breadth is extremely central to why so many people today can actually connect to this agenda, and it's explaining part of how come the SDGs have such a much greater success compared to the MDGs. So basically what I'm trying to say is that all of us, almost irrespective of the area of the field we'll be working on, can find some relevance in the Sustainable Development Goals. A second important point that the SDGs bring about, and I'll mention just 3 points. We can definitely discuss more in the future, but the second one relates to the universalization of the goals. The MDGs, so the Millennium Development Goals, the predecessors of the SDGs, they have been focusing on the developing countries. A novelty with the SDGs is that the targets are basically universalized. And I think this is a really big departure from the international discourse in the past. So before 2015, when this discourse was really addressing developing countries. So now it's for the first time when we have a common language and goals addressing all countries. And I think this comes with several challenges and several positive aspects. I'll mention just one of each. One positive aspect related to this is that it departs from the previous approach, which was a more of a top-down approach, approach between donors and recipient countries, developed countries and developing countries. So with the SDGs, we put everybody in the same pot, basically, and these sort of inequalities are a little bit reduced. And also, it's an agenda that we all come together at with our own challenges in our communities. And I think it's in this sense, the sense of community is emphasized, and not the sense of separation, and not the inequality in wealth that we see in the world today, which is basically to a large extent what the MDGs were doing, just focusing on the developing countries. The third point I wanted to mention with regard to the SDG agenda is that, and where it brings a novel thing, or before moving there, the negative consequences of this universalization of the SDGs, I think is also that the agenda also becomes an imposition, a much stronger imposition. So also this is a recurrent topic in development, which refers to ownership and how development should be owned locally. And I think we all come from local communities, and we know how important it is for people to feel that they own the transformation that is produced in the community. So this is a recurring theme in international development. Is probably one of the main themes and challenges that especially official development assistance is facing in developing countries, and a reason for which we see a lot of failure also in terms of development assistance. But basically, the SDGs, by defining the agenda, it's basically limiting the level of ownership that communities can take over their own development agenda. So we have a global agenda, and we have less space probably as things are defined already for a local agenda. Now, the SDGs do mitigate this in a certain way. The SDGs are not compulsory, and indicators can also be agreed at national levels. So there are ways to adapt to local conditions, and I think that is important. Nevertheless, it is quite extensive. We have 17 goals now, up from 8 goals in the past, and hundreds of basic targets and indicators. So it is a prescribed, a defined way of seeing development, and a defined way in it is basically prescribing a way forward, which is not it cannot take into consideration all the differences in local contexts. Now, besides this universalization of the SDGs, I think the third important point that the SDG agenda brings relates to the financing for development, and the fact that we are moving away, or basically there is a recognition that we will not be able to achieve the goals if this stay the remit, in the mandates, let's say, of only the states in the world. So what we see an opening with regard both to making space for contributions, but also asking for financial contributions, especially moving towards the private sector. So there is a really important shift towards the private sector in development. And this comes through in at least 2 ways. One, there is a recognition of the importance of the private sector for development processes. And a lot of the budgets that we will be seeing probably from now on will be rather targeted towards the business sector and less so towards the civil society sector. And at the same time, there are more expectations on the private sector to contribute financially to the achievement of the SDGs. Okay, so this is sort of where we're coming from, and we now have this pandemic, and this pandemic is also obviously going to have quite an important impact on everything that the agenda is proposing. I will leave this a little bit for later, and I wanted to go back to you and ask, in the aftermath of the crisis, keeping in mind the impact that the crisis has had or is having on your own communities, which SDG do you find that do you think will be the most relevant? Can you please write the number in the chat so that we all see what SDG. I can go back to the numbers so that you have them in front of you and can maybe easier indicate. So we have SDG 3, SDG 10, 3 and 8, 1 and 3. We will concentrate in the next step on the 4 SDGs. The question is more general, from the 17 SDGs for your own communities. Which one do you expect will be the most important in the aftermath of the crisis? We know the crisis is obviously a public health crisis, so we do expect that number 3 is going to be important. But this obviously is extremely important during the crisis. Now, after the crisis, which one do you expect that will be the most important one? So we have 17 to enable the others. We have 1, 3, 4, 8, and 13, 1 and 8, 4, 10, 8, and 17. Excellent. So we see also here that we perceive the importance of these SDGs in different ways according to the communities we come from, and I think what this is showing is also that the way the agenda is designed, the fact that it is not compulsory, it's optional, and the fact that indicators can be adapted, the fact that in the 17 areas. Most topics, most development challenges are comprised. Actually, it opens a really good avenue for engagement at a community level all across the globe. So I think what we see, probably one of the most often indicated goal in your responses so far is obviously number 3, but then number 8 and yes, probably number 8, and that's one of the goals that we will be discussing about. So thank you so much for engaging with this. Now, the next question, we won't go to Menti. I think this writing in the chat is much quicker, and it makes the point. It serves what we want to do. Which SDG will your organization prioritize after the COVID-19 pandemic? So this is the next question. If you can think about this and indicate which SDG do you expect your own organization to focus on primarily after the crisis, that would be really excellent. We have a 17, so that is the partnership for the goals. We have 1, 3, 4, and 10, 11. 3 and 4 in Italy, 11 and 17 again. So basically, from your responses here, we see that several of the goals will be important, and obviously this relates a lot also to the mission of our organizations. But as I think there are a lot of community foundations in the room, the impacts of the crisis are quite systemic. So as community foundations, I think the fact that we care about the well-being and the capacity of the community in general is making the SDGs relevant and is making this crisis extremely relevant. So I think it is an important question whether our strategies from before the crisis are going to be equally relevant after, and if not, how are we going to adapt to the new context? So thank you so much for these responses, and the next step we are going to take is to look more in detail at goals 3, 4, 8, and 10. And how we're going to do this is we'll do this together. So we'll go in through each of the goals, of these 4 goals, one at a time. And I will provide a very brief introduction Then we have some questions for you and would like you to take some time to reflect and share your answers in the chat so that we can have insights in this respect. And then we would be also glad if one person or two per each of the goals can actually intervene and share your thoughts. Okay, so that's basically what we're proposing. And before going there, I would like to maybe take a moment to point out some of the challenges that are brought by this crisis. Because while it is a public health crisis, it has impact over a number of areas and affect basically the SDGs in general. Okay, so we are moving towards a new reality. Are we? Are we not? I mean, the opinions are split, but the impact is definitely important. So I think a first aspect to start from is that COVID-19 is not the only crisis in town, especially if we are to refer to Europe and more particularly to the EU. We are at the moment juggling basically with a number of crises. We have had a severe economic crisis in 2008, and we are still, parts of Europe are still recovering from that. Overall, we are only now reaching the pre-crisis levels of growth. And now we have the pandemic, which is very likely going to have quite a significant impact on growth levels. So here a few economic expectations. So we expect the crisis to lead to a decrease in the GDP of all probably European countries. We have some, and not only, we have some examples here where we see the potential of the negative potential of impact of the crisis on growth on various sectors of the economy and in various countries. And we see basically that the retail and wholesale sectors are some of the most affected, transportation as well. Then these are a few other aspects which I think are important from an economic perspective. We can look at again at the downfall in the sectors, in the economic sectors, construction, retail, sales, and trade, in countries that have enforced a lockdown and countries that have tightened recommendations to stay at home. We can see that where lockdown occurred, we have much steeper downward trends in the three sectors of the economy. Nevertheless, across the board, we see a decrease. Countries that have only tightened recommendations to stay at home, they are recovering. They're closer to the pre-crisis levels. Nevertheless, probably they have taken or are taking a greater toll in terms of the impact on public health. So basically, what we see is that the crisis comes with an important, significant impact on economic growth and on economic activity. What we also see is that with regards to the emerging markets, we've seen recently 90 billion outflow, which is the largest outflow ever recorded. $90 billion. And then we also see that 81% of the global workforce lives in countries with mandatory or recommended closures. And here on the smaller graph, we can see the share of countries with and without social protection responses by region. So we see that while a number of countries have enforced social protection responses, some have not. And obviously, the kind of social protections measures that have been informed differ greatly. I think this is extremely relevant in relation to the SDG 10. 8 and 10, but we will go into that in the discussion. Now, further aspects also related to economic indicators, we expect a decrease in remittances with over 20%, which is a really big impact for many of the developing countries, including for some of the countries in Central Eastern Europe. We see an increase in food prices, especially in developing countries, and the highest increases in food prices at the moment are in some of the countries in Central and Eastern Africa. We have at the moment over 1.2 billion learners affected by the crisis, and this represents more than 70% of all learners in 177 countries. These are learners who are not basically going to school and have moved towards online versions of education. But this again comes with a great impact on access to education and leads to inequalities. Furthermore, what is expected is that we will have more than 500 million people pushed into poverty, which is the first time in the last 3 decades when poverty will increase. So this has a direct connection to, for example, SDG 1, but definitely has a lot of implication for all the other SDGs. This obviously is related to an overall increase in unemployment and the big toll that the measures to counter the crisis have on the informal sector, where, yes, there are no protective measures. Finally, another aspect that I wanted to bring to our attention is the increasing risk of authoritarianism and the closing space for civil society. This is not a new trend, and that is why it is very likely that this crisis will contribute to this. So basically, it will augment the trends in this direction that we have seen before, and I think even some of the EU countries are at risk in this regard. Okay, so these are just some initial or some input, let's say, for our discussion, and we will be moving into the discussion of the 4 SDGs. We will continue with discussing each of the 4 SDGs. The SDG 3, this one is focusing on health, and basically I want to briefly. This is a lot of text, but it's basically I want to really just emphasize the key targets that we are having under SDG 3. So here we are looking at reducing global maternal mortality, preventive preventable death of newborns and children under 5 years of age, and the epidemics of AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria, and neglected tropical diseases, and combat hepatitis, waterborne diseases, and other communicable diseases. Reduce by 1/3 premature mortality from non-communicable diseases, strengthen the prevention and treatment of sustainable abuse, and basically reduce the traffic accidents. Furthermore, ensure universal access to sexual and reproductive health care services, advance on and achieve universal health coverage, then support the research and development of vaccines and medicines, increase health financing, and focusing on training and retention of health workforce in developing countries, strengthen the capacity of all countries, in particular developing countries, for early warning, risk reduction, and management of national and global health risks, So basically, we see that under SDG 3, a lot of the targets are related to actually relating to the current pandemic. In this sense, well, on the one hand, it's great that we have these goals. On the other hand, it would have been probably better if we would have been further on this agenda. But definitely, there are several instances where advancing on these goals is now supporting countries in tackling the pandemic. May I please ask you to take a moment and to think about how COVID-19 is affecting your own community with regard to these targets. So can you please share with us a few thoughts on how this goal, focusing on health and well-being, is affecting your own communities? I will leave this a slide with the targets here, so that you can reflect on this while you are thinking about this. So if you manage to look over the targets and to think about how this is affecting your own community, it would be great if you can share one or two thoughts. Also, please, on the right hand, you have a hand where you can also raise your hand in case you would rather like to have an input. So we can take 1 to 2 input contributions for each of the goals. So please do either write down or raise your hand. It would be great to hear how this is affecting your community. Perfect. Okay, so we have a response from Odorhei. In Romania, we are lucky. The number of infected people are really small. We have done some quick answers, but there are no research activities to probably go into more depth. Basically, the pandemic showed that the community is unprepared, or the health system is unprepared for such situations. From Ivona, we see that the community foundations raise money to support hospital and to support a hospital with devices and equipment. So basically, in these answers, we see that we have an immediate response to this. If we are thinking about the impact of on the longer term, I think what Rosie from Odorhei is mentioning here, realizing that the level of unpreparedness is high, will most likely lead to more attention, and that might also be a positive outcome in the of the crisis. Excellent, thank you so much. So we can then move to the second question. 1 second. Which is, how would you use the SDG 3 in your work after the pandemic? Is this is SDG 3 with its targets an area that you will be focusing on after the pandemic? And if so, are you in which way? Please also, maybe to be faster, if you can raise your hand and intervene verbally, that might be a better solution. So please do raise your hand if you can intervene, and we can hear your contribution. So is this going to stay on your agenda after the crisis? And if so, how will you be using the SDG 3 for advancing on the health-related targets. Excuse me. Okay, so please let's keep this in mind. Maybe what we can do is to briefly go through the other 3 SDGs. And if I can please ask you to keep in mind these questions for each of the SDGs, of the next 3 SDGs, it would be great. It would be great to have interventions on each one of them, at least to have an understanding of how we see these SDGs affecting our communities and what are we going to do in the direction of these SDGs as organizations active in our communities. So we can move forward to the SDG 4. And SDG 4 is about the quality of education. Some of the targets are ensuring that all girls and boys complete free, equitable, and quality primary and secondary education. Ensure that all girls and boys have access to quality early childhood development care and pre-primary education. Ensure equal access for all women and men to affordable and quality technical, vocational, and tertiary education, including university. Focus on building relevant skills, eliminating gender disparities in education, and reducing basically illiteracy. Some of the targets also refer to the importance of peace and sustainable and development education, the importance of educational facilities, the importance of accessibility, and in consequence expanding globally the number of scholarships, and increase the supply of qualified teachers. So this is education. Would anyone want to contribute with an input with regards to how the current crisis is affecting the educational targets in your community, or how you plan as an organization to address this goal in the post-COVID-19 period? Okay, please think about this. I will move on to SDG 8, and we will open the discussion basically after because of time reasons, we will open the discussion after after we go through all 4 of them. So SDG 8 is about decent work and economic growth. And in terms of targets, it looks at sustaining per capita economic growth in accordance with national circumstances, and in particular, at least 7% gross domestic product growth per annum in the least developed countries. So sustaining economic growth, higher levels of economic productivity through diversification, technological upgrading, and innovation. Promote productive activities, decent job creation, entrepreneurship, and creativity and innovation. So promote policies that support these aspects. Improve progressively global resource efficiency in consumptions and production, and endeavor to decouple economic growth from environmental degradation. Achieve full and productive employment and decent work for all women and men. Substantially reduce the proportion of youth not in employment, education, or training. Eradicate forced labor and modern slavery and human trafficking. Protect labor rights. Promote sustainable tourism. Strengthen the capacity of domestic financial institutions. Increase aid for trade. So basically several targets that together aim to increase the conditions for decent work, and ensure economic growth. So please do think if this is an area that you are focusing on, how will this impact, how will this be impacted by COVID, and also how your organization will engage with these targets after the pandemic. And finally, the SDG 10 is focusing on reducing inequalities, and basically by 2030, the first target aims to progressively achieve and sustain income growth of the bottom 40% of the population at a rate higher than national average, empower and promote the social, economic, and political inclusion of all, ensure equal opportunities and reduce inequalities of outcome, adopt policies, especially fiscal, wage, and social protection policies, and progressively achieve greater equality, improve the regulation and monitoring of global financial markets, ensure enhanced representation and voice for developing countries, facilitate orderly, safe, regular, and responsible migration and mobility, encourage official development assistance to states where need is greatest, and focus on remittances. So this is SDG 10, focusing on reduced inequalities. Please, if anyone would like to intervene and share how they think the crisis would impact any of the 4 goals, I think this would be highly appreciated. Also, if you have a contribution with regard to how your organization plans to address this the impact of the crisis after COVID is taken care of on these indicators. Okay, so we have an input on education and how basically closing the schools broadens the gap and inequality when it comes to accessibility. Indeed. Okay, as we do not have further input, we can move forward. And so also a little bit coming from your side, but I think also in general, we can see that the pandemic is definitely impacting the SDGs, all of them. And I think the data that I brought in the discussion earlier shows that all indicators are affected. Now, an important point to keep in mind is that not all indicators are affected negatively. So while especially those indicators that we look at are likely to be impacted, especially on the short term, negatively, we have other indicators, especially regarding climate, that for the short while are actually impacted positively. Less travel, less pollution is basically leading to better indicators on carbon emissions. However, I think an important aspect that is often stressed is that this reduction is not sustainable if after the crisis we go back to life as usual. So the crisis is creating this exceptional moment as we speak, with certain impact on the targets that we are looking at with the SDGs. Positive outcomes come of this for some of the indicators, especially related to climate. Now, in order to maintain these levels of, especially on the climate side, our lifestyles cannot go back to how our lifetime was before. I think an important point to keep in mind is that after the 2008 crisis, we had a spike in terms of in negative terms with regard to these indicators, and this is likely to happen again unless we take further measures. Now, obviously, education is affected. Inequality is growing. The access to jobs is reduced. Unemployment is growing. So the kind of education that is provided is not growing the quality, especially in the short term. Now, a last point I want to bring in here is the fact that all these aspects also can have a negative, can have a positive impact in the midterm. So acknowledging that we have a weak health infrastructure, acknowledging that or maybe realizing that we have much more possibilities to engage digitally. I think all these are going to play and help us in the midterm to actually catch up and go back towards the goals that we have or targets that we have within the SDGs. So a few final thoughts, and then we can also open for discussion. A few final thoughts from my side with regards to what the SDGs mean in this period and especially after. And I would emphasize a few aspects that that are actually also extremely positive. The fact, I think that probably one of the most important is that the SDGs exist. And why I'm saying that is because there is already a global agenda existing. This has already brought together large groups of stakeholders, a huge amount of energy already. So there is a common understanding with regard to where we want to go. So this is a huge process that has taken decades basically to arrive at. And the fact that the goals are articulated as they are, I think will be a guidance for globally for all actors engaged in their own communities in addressing the effects of the crisis. Now, I think an important general point to make here is that the SDGs are actually referring to how our communities develop, how they grow, how they become better. And I think that comes extremely close to the mission of any community foundation. So especially for community foundations, probably reflecting on the impact of COVID, reflecting on the SDGs and their own current strategies is probably important in adapting our strategies, in adapting our activities in the post-COVID period. Furthermore, the SDGs, as they are pushing us to collect data, to report and to engage people on issues that impact our communities. So I think this is a process that will be that is actually augmented by the crisis. Indeed, on certain areas like health, we have, as Ivona was mentioning, we have a quite high mobilization among community foundations and civil society actors in general to mitigate the impacts of the crisis, and I think that is going to lead to having more strength in behind the SDG agenda in the future. A third point relates to the financing for the SDGs. I think it's too early to possibly comment on this, as we don't know what decisions will be taken. But up to now, after an initial quite slow response, we see that the international community is actually mobilizing to support developing countries, and where a lot of the SDG targets are harder to achieve. So we have a lot of a big part of the international community that is thinking about this. The financial commitments are starting to be articulated, and it is very likely that that this crisis will actually push the international community to come together in a more structured and more organized way to address the SDGs. It's very likely also that this will be an important window of opportunity to further bring together the private sector, or to bring the private sector closer to the SDG efforts. And so basically, I think this is a window of opportunity also in actually mounting the engagement and efforts to achieve the SDGs and to pay attention to the challenges that exist in developing countries and in all our communities as well. Now, an important point I think to mention, and I have two more points to make here, is that we were actually falling behind already before the crisis started on a lot of the SDGs. So what I'm trying to say is that this crisis may actually push us to take this agenda actually even more serious than before, and to actually generate the capacity and the energy needed to actually push the SDG agenda further. Finally, this COVID-19 situation can also be an opportunity, as I mentioned, for resources, for increased responsibility. I think we, having faced such a crisis, we are becoming much more responsible in a lot of ways with regard to the challenges of our communities. A lot of new stakeholders are probably ready to be engaged. A lot of people have basically experienced themselves what it means to go through such a crisis. So I think it is a really important window of opportunity for using the SDGs to bring the attention of our communities to important targets that affect their well-being, and to, in consequence, increase the responsibility of various stakeholders in our communities. And I think a final point here is that the crisis has also been a moment that has generated actually leadership in a lot of directions, in a lot of ways. And I think this leadership can well use the SDG agenda for actually making the next step to think about, to become more strategic in how to ensure the well-being of our communities. So I will basically stop here, emphasizing the importance of resources, responsibility, leadership, and the window of opportunity that this crisis brings in all these directions. And I hope there are interventions on your side in this discussion. So please, if there are any suggestions, comments, or questions, would be excellent. You can also raise your hand so that you can speak, or additionally you can obviously write in the chat. Well, basically, on my side, this is what I wanted to share. So if there are further questions, we can further continue the discussion. I think there are 7 more minutes to engage, and alternatively, we can also stop here the discussion. I want to really thank you for this opportunity to discuss the SDGs. And yes. I see somebody's typing something, so in case there is a question, it would be a pleasure to continue the discussion for a little bit. So the point refers to bringing stakeholders together and how important that is. I echo that. I think the crisis has actually provided us a space, unfortunately, but has provided a space for doing that, and that is happening. Yes, I hope that we are going to be able to use this, despite the negative consequences, to use these windows of opportunities that are being opened actually by the crisis, to take our activities and to bring together various new stakeholders and all stakeholders engaged in our work in our communities. So thank you so much for this opportunity. And indeed, so a new comment refers to increasing local fundraising efforts and the response, and raising basically the profile of the Community Foundation with new partners. I think this is a really important point. It is basically indeed it has been, and I think a lot of community foundations, at least in the Romanian context, but I'm pretty sure in all our countries, have taken the opportunity to be among the first to respond to the crisis and to show the utility of such a mechanism as that of the community foundations within a local community. This is definitely a moment that has brought the Community Foundation much closer to the communities we work in. And I think it's definitely something to build on, and to bring various parts of our community closer to the mechanism of the Community Foundation. Okay.